Great. I think the room's full. I think there may be one more seat there at the front if anyone wants to take it. But good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Bright Blue panel event on accelerating levelling up in the 2020s. My name is Alexandra Jezeph, and I'm on the board of Bright Blue, an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. It has 7 major research themes, including bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions, and connected communities. In hosting this event, we're very pleased to be partnering with IPPR North and Power to Change. If you're on Twitter, please do use the hashtag BrightBlue and the hashtag CPC23 for the event. And the Twitter handles are We Are Bright Blue, People's Biz, which ends in a Z, and at IPPR North. So the UK is renowned as a land of opportunity, but it is one that suffers from significant regional inequalities. London is identified as having a 40% higher productivity level than the UK average, and I calculated that on the circa 2 hours that it takes to get from London to Nottingham, gross disposable household income per head falls by about £125 a minute. Levelling up has been a key political agenda, particularly for the many Conservative MPs that won red wall seats at the last election. And hot off the press, the PM announced today that we have 1.1 billion of levelling up funding to be handed out over the next decade, with 20 million going to 55 overlooked towns across the UK. And some of the themes that came out from that were transport improvements, tackling crime, and also enhancing town centres, particularly looking at high streets. So this evening's debate will discuss these themes as well as examine ways to meaningfully accelerate levelling up. We'll consider a range of levers, whether that's improving physical and digital connectivity, developing skills, promoting agglomeration economies, or building social capital, and much more. So we've asked our panellists to consider a number of different questions. I won't read them all out, but I'll pick 3. So these include, is a levelling up agenda still a successful electoral agenda for the Conservative Party? Today will probably influence that answer as well. Where has the current government made the most progress against its 12 missions for 2030 outlined in the Levelling Up white paper? And can the trailblazer deals in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands show that deep devolution is affordable and credible? So we're delighted to have no less than 7 panellists joining us to debate these important questions. We have Dehenna Davison MP, who is former Minister for Levelling Up and MP for Bishop Auckland. Joe Gideon MP, who is Vice Chair of the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods and is MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. Chris Smyth, who is Whitehall Editor for The Times. Councillor Jamieson, who is the former chairman of the Local Government Association, Tom Pope, who is Deputy Chief Economist for the Institute of Government, Ailbhe McNabola, who is Deputy Chief Executive of Power to Change, and Zoe Bellingham, who is Director IPPR North. So a warm welcome to all of our speakers. We've got just an hour to cover a very hot topic. So if I can invite Dehenna Davison to kick us off, and I'll limit everyone to 5 minutes if that's okay, given our numbers. So, Dehenna.
I'm setting a timer so we don't get off on the wrong foot. Well, thank you from me to everyone in this room, firstly, for coming along to this. Because levelling up is something that is so blooming important. Obviously, I was a levelling up minister until about 3 weeks ago. Now I can say what I really think. But the good news is what I really think really matched what I used to say when I was a minister as well, which is that levelling up, we often think of it as an electoral thing, and one of the questions we were asked to consider was, is it still an electoral success? But I think levelling up is so much more important than political. I think levelling up in the UK is a moral mission. It isn't right that there are people born in certain parts of the country that don't have access to the same opportunities as those in more affluent postcodes. It's absolutely right that we do what we can in government at all levels, at a national level and at a local level, to try and redress some of those balances, to make sure whether you're from Bath or Basingstoke or Birkenhead, you've got the same access to opportunities as anyone else to get on in life. Obviously, it's up to you to do it. You've still got to put in the hard work to make your own life a success, but access to those opportunities is the key thing. And that's why I was really delighted last year to be asked to take on the Levelling Up brief. And in that time, I could wax lyrical about so many of the things that I was working on. But I think what it's really about, what levelling up is really about, is empowering communities. It would be very easy for a government to give a really top-down approach and say, this is what you need to do to improve your area. But in my view, that is kind of completely missing the point. It's about empowering local communities to do it for themselves. They know their communities best. They know their people best. And that's why I think one of the key elements of levelling up that we are getting right is on devolution. Now, I'm not going to talk about the politics of devolution because we sit here as Tories in Greater Manchester. One day we will take this stronghold. I am determined of that. But it's about what it means for local communities. It's local people being involved in local decision making and taking back local control. And I think that is so crucial. And one of the key things that I worked on in my ministerial brief was rolling out the Trailblazer devolution deals here in Greater Manchester and in the West Midlands under Andy Street. And a lot of people say, well, what does this mean? I mean, devolution is a really complex, confusing thing for most people who don't follow politics. What it means here in Greater Manchester is a better transport system. You'll have seen the yellow buses driving around the city, and if you haven't, go and get on one, they're great. It's called the B Network. And that is because we allowed local franchising of bus services so that locally, that could be controlled at a local level to meet local needs. That is what this is all about. It's also about funding. We could talk a lot about funding. I'm sure we could take up this entire hour talking about levelling up funding. I don't want to do that. But what I think is a real benefit of devolution in this sense is that longevity of funding. We've had a lot of critique, indeed every government I think has had a lot of critique about pots, bidding pots, putting your bid for this, putting your bid for that. You're never quite sure where the next pound is coming from. That's exactly why we as a government took an approach of simplifying funding. It's not the sexiest of topics, but it's one that I really got my teeth stuck into as a minister because I recognise how important it is for local areas to have that longevity, have that certainty of where the funding is coming from. And that's a really core element of our devolution deals. A lot of these areas that are in our Tier 3 mayoral devolution deals have a 30-year development fund. So they know that for the next 30 years, there will be X million pounds coming in that they can use to invest in local infrastructure and local priorities. That is a great thing. That is a great thing for local areas to be able to forward plan, front load that, really put in place the right sort of infrastructure investment locally. But as I said, it's about empowerment, and it's why I'm actually really pleased to see a lot of focus. You'll have seen it today with the excellent announcement that came out of my old department around towns funding. But that focus on towns, too often when we talk about sort of things like major infrastructure projects, we focus on the big cities. And of course that's right, that there is deprivation in a lot of inner cities, we know that. But actually towns so often get overlooked, and that's why a few years ago we announced the Towns Fund, which is helping, I think it's over 100 towns all over the country. My own constituency benefited from the Towns Fund. We're seeing excellent redevelopment work going on now. And of course the new announcement today gives a little bit more certainty of funding that will be coming in for the next 10 years that towns can draw upon to really help boost their high streets and tackle some of the challenges of antisocial behaviour, which we know local people are really concerned about. So I've gone on a massive kind of rant there about some of the stuff that I'm really interested in when it comes to levelling up, but I can't reiterate the point I made at the beginning enough, which is that this is a moral mission. Whether it's electorally successful or not, it's the right thing to do, and that's what we always have to remember. And that's why I think, I made the point that I don't want to bring politics into any discussion on devolution, because it's about all parties kind of coming together to make the right decisions for local people. That's what devolution's all about. That's what levelling up's all about. And the thing is, if local communities feel more empowered, feel like their area is improving, then of course there'll be electoral success from that too. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dehenna. So you covered the moral mission, devolution, need for better transport, towns funds, and this issue about pots, which I think might come up later in the conversation as well. Jo, your reflections, if I can ask you to go next.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So obviously I agree with 95%.
I'll take that.
Where I differ slightly is that I absolutely think that the infrastructure to enable levelling up is important, but I would talk more about social infrastructure. And I think that when we look at left behind communities, we're not just looking at towns, cities, rural areas, but we're looking at within affluent cities, there are pockets of deprivation that are just as bad as parts of the country where deprivation holistically is considered bad. And I think if we define the need for support in terms of the overall picture for an area, we miss out those really important small pockets. So levelling up fundamentally is about fairness and fair play, and that everybody, from wherever they come from, should have the same opportunities. Mistakenly, it was talked about as a sort of north-south divide thing, and that the red wall was, that the Midlands and the North were getting all the money, and the South wasn't getting anything. And I think that you'll hear me saying this often. For me, levelling up is a prism through which all government policies should be viewed. It's about looking and checking that everything that the government does doesn't create greater inequalities unintentionally. So Stoke-on-Trent is interesting. We branded ourselves the litmus test for levelling up, which is it helped in terms of getting lots and lots of government funding. What it also meant, though, was that lots of journalists came up to Stoke-on-Trent and said, "Well, have you levelled up? Where is it?" Inevitably, would see the sort of tumbleweeds blowing down the high street and go, "Well, clearly levelling up hasn't succeeded, has it?" Which, again, to me, annoyed me, because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of, a community that's been left behind, deindustrialised over a period of decades. You cannot, no matter how much money you throw at it, change the entire economic profile and people's sense of place and civic pride and everything in the space of one electoral cycle. And because of that, it's absolutely vital that we don't over-politicise it, that we see it as something that whoever runs the country needs to do, because it's about fairness, and it's about people's perception of their own lives. And that isn't always about having the motorway, next door, or a big concert hall or something. It can often be as simple as that their high streets are clean, that they feel safe when they go out at night. And I think that we need to look at the sort of Kaizen approach to levelling up, which is incremental, small things that can happen across the country in communities. And if you look at it in that way, then it isn't a large sort of cheque that government has to write out, because a lot of the improvements can happen through empowering communities to do it for themselves, through empowering local businesses to actually play a greater role in their communities, volunteering and philanthropy, which I think is vastly underutilised in this country. So we need to harness everybody that makes up our society in a way that will work for the benefit of everybody, because we're all invested in our local communities, whether it's as an employer, as somebody who works in public services, or as somebody who doesn't work and is struggling with the cost of living. So I think that's essential, and is that my 5 minutes?
I think that's
probably enough.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your reflections on fairness and fair play, and perhaps also I think this theme of empowering local communities will come up again. To go back to the order that I should have been doing it, Chris.
That's why I was surprised.
Sorry about your surprise.
I'm not Chris.
Thank
Chris.
You. Well, I thought you asked about the politics, so I thought I'd start with that, given we've got many other sort of, policy expert people here. And Boris Johnson essentially won an 80-seat majority by uniting Brexiteers, and that meant getting support from people and communities that have felt poorly served by how politics had operated previously. And if you look at the opinion polls now, the biggest swings, the reason why Labour has a 20-point lead, is the swings amongst Brexiteers, and effectively these are the same voters. The reason the Conservatives are behind are because those voters who, as Boris Johnson put it, lent them the vote last time, are considering taking it back. So politically, I think it does remain crucial to the outcome of the next election. But many people, including perhaps some of those voters, are perhaps sceptical of the term. They're still not sure what it means, and it is a very baggy term. Put it politely, it's capacious. It can include a lot of things. It can include north-south. It can include rich-poor. It can include anything else. So I think there's some tensions in there that have not properly been resolved, and I'll touch on a couple of those. And if you look at the white paper the government published last year, that was a sort of serious, proper big piece of work, that started from the foundation of Jericho in 7000 BC, went through the Medici Florence, through the Industrial Revolution, and called for, I've got a quote here, it said, levelling up as a long-term endeavour that requires a fundamental shift in how central and local government, the private sector and civil society operate. That is a hell of an ambition. So that was in February last year. Had, 4 months of that before the entire government imploded, and you had, we don't need to rehearse the last year of politics here, but it's not a surprise that such a fundamental ambition requiring years of disciplined effort from government has not perhaps been transformative given the politics we've had. And in many ways, it's wonder if anything has been done rather than nothing has. And obviously, Rishi Sunak speaks the right noises about levelling up, but it's clearly not one of his 5 priorities for this year. We will wait to see what he announces at this conference in this area at all. But central government takes its cue from the Prime Minister, and they can see that he is not. It's not as central to him as it was for Boris Johnson. And there is another one of the tensions, because in the white paper it was all about what central government had a big role to play in terms of driving this mission, rewiring Whitehall, taking so these levelling up ambitions into account in all its decision making. Yet at the same time, it was also fundamentally about devolution and devolving power away, and it's never been entirely clear how those two things balance. And many years devolution has been a success. I mean, you talked about Dehenna talked about the buses here in Manchester. It's a good example. You can look at West Midlands as well, Teesside. Lots of good examples of good things happening. But elsewhere, ministers are reluctant to devolve power, and for very understandable reasons. Giving away control is hard, not only because you create political opponents. In the case of Manchester, even people on the same side can make life difficult for you, as Andy Street and indeed Ben Houcher today have shown, but also because of the way our system works, they often find themselves devolving power, but accountability rests with them. And this is something about how we in the media operate and how regional media has been hollowed out. But ultimately, the buck stops in Westminster, in Whitehall. And if all ministers can say, "Well, I've devolved that power; it's nothing to do with me," that is a difficult answer for them. They don't find it satisfactory, and they don't like giving it. And particularly if they don't trust the quality of local leadership, it is going to be very hard for them to devolve in that way. Which is why we've ended up, I think, with the bidding process, the pots of money that we've talked about again. We won't rehearse that. We'll just and Andy Street's criticism of the begging bowl culture, but you are not going to fundamentally rewire central and local government and the private sector if you have local authorities sort of sitting there like baby birds, sort of with their mouths gaping upwards, hoping that something's going to be regurgitated from Whitehall. I mean, that is not. But except for, again, the politics, you can see why that works for ministers. They like having a big announcement. Today, what is it, £1 billion? Well, that's a nice way to start a conference. And you can see the political incentive is always to keep control, so you have the timing and you get the credit for these things, and you don't just get the blame. And given where we are in the electoral cycle, that becomes ever more important. We've only got a year now, pretty much at most, until the election. We are not going to achieve a fundamental rewiring of society in that time. So we need, ministers want something to show for this, and so it's much easier for them to use what levers they have, and that short time is available. And I remember one of my first conversations in December 2019 with one of the new so-called Red Wall MPs said to me, look, I was elected for 3 reasons. 1 is Brexit, 2 is Jeremy Corbyn, and 3 is the state of the high street. Now, at the next election, I'm not going to have 1 and 2, so we really need to do something about the state of the high street. So anything that can make people's lives better in the next year in a visible way, is essential, is politically essential, and that can be criticised as the sort of hanging basket model of levelling up, and which is true, it's not transformational change, but it is important both politically and as Joe was saying, for people who live in those communities. So you asked, one of the questions we were asked was those 12 missions in that levelling up white paper, how's it going? And if you look at them, they're all perfectly good metrics, but they're all out to 2030. It's too early to judge clearly how any of them are going, but you look at them, you think, well, maybe there's something about transport, maybe there's something about broadband. It's hard to look at any of the others and think, well, we're well on track for those. And ultimately, if you look at the polls, it is quite likely that those 12 missions are going to end up at the mercy of Keir Starmer's 5 missions, and it is really not clear how they would fit in at all. I mean, Labour doesn't like talking about levelling up, understandably. They see it as a Conservative slogan, but I suppose they are going to have to grapple with these same problems, and it is not clear how they would do it differently, because I don't think they have resolved some of those tensions themselves either. But I suppose I'll end where I started with the politics, in the sense of this realignment that we have seen with Brexit has changed what a swing seat is. So in that sense, if it is not Basildon anymore but Burnley, which is going to decide the fate of elections in the future, then there is a much clearer political incentive to actually do something about some of these deep-seated problems than there perhaps has been for a generation, and politicians, that is an incentive politicians respond to. So the longer term of this is perhaps optimistic.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris, for your reflections there and painting some of that, the political context. We'll now move quickly to Tom to share your thoughts from the Institute of Government.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd agree with a lot of what Chris said, actually, particularly the point he made about transformational change. And I think that means from a policy perspective, actually levelling up is quite a hard sell because there's only so much you can do in 5 years to tackle what are really deep-seated structural problems that are the result of, frankly, decades of policy failure and a set of pretty powerful economic forces that have led to London in particular being so much stronger than lots of other places across the country. As Chris said, the levelling up missions are out to 2030. There's a reason for that. Probably 2030 is quite soon even to see the type of transformational change that you'd want to see. And you can, politically that's very difficult because you absolutely have to demonstrate what you've delivered across a parliament. But I think if you look at, the international examples of transformational change, even in Germany where there was a massive political imperative, huge investment, it's still 15, 20 years before you really saw the big fruits and sort of the big reduction in regional gaps and that transformational change that Chris quoted from the white paper. I think that means there's inherently been a tendency in the policies that we have seen that have been badged as levelling up to be more focused on some of that short-term stuff, which is not to say that, the hanging baskets and improving high streets is not important, all of the things that Joe mentioned, absolutely they are, but they aren't the type of transformational change that is going to sort of change the economic forces and change the equilibrium, if you like, to really drive big change, which I think over 10, 20 years is what we want to be trying to achieve as a country. And I think we probably have not focused quite enough on some of those strategic investments, really focused on our potential economic powerhouses, like here in Manchester, like in Birmingham, which don't just bring benefit to the people who live right in those places, but if delivered well, should also benefit surrounding towns and the wider area as well. And I think if I look at the set of policies that have been announced, that it does feel like that's been missing a bit. And certainly if you wanted to achieve these things by 2030, there probably would have been more big investments you'd have liked to see. I think what really matters in terms of how we're going to deliver levelling up, and the reason why this has been so hard in the past, is that the way we make policy has really not been very good, both in Whitehall as being over-centralised, the fact there's been so much churn in the types of policies that matter for levelling up over the last few years, the last 30 years even, if it's regional economic development, the different organisations that we've had over that time, LEPS most recently being scrapped. If you look at skills, all the different various versions of skills qualifications and the different bodies that have been involved there. And ultimately, that's what we need to fix, the short-termism. And I think that's where we at the Institute for Government focus a lot on how policy is made. The white paper we thought was very good in recognising those changes and actually instituting the types of reforms that should help to fix it. Having these long-term missions is a great way to try to run government and try to actually make sure this isn't just a concern of what was Dehenna's department, but also of the other departments in Whitehall that are really relevant as well. Because ultimately, lots of the levers are not held in DLUC, they're held in DFT and DFE, and it needs to be a priority for them as well. I think it's fair to say that over the last year, there's been a bit of a loss of momentum around some of those. What was a levelling up cabinet committee became an interministerial group, where that's very much sort of Whitehall speak. But there's a sense that it's become, I think, more a agenda driven out of DLUC than it is a full Whitehall-wide agenda. The difference, and the thing that's different there, and where I think the white paper again was very good, was to come back to this point on devolution, where actually the progress has continued to be made. And one way we're going to improve how we make regional policies by taking some of it out of the centre and giving it to local government. And I think the really positive thing there as well is that isn't a party political point at this stage as well. There is real cross-party agreement that Whitehall is too centralised, that we need to devolve further. And that's why I think we will look back on levelling up as really having been a game-changing moment for how we approach regional policy in this country, even if we haven't achieved everything in the 5 years since 2019.
Thank you very much, Tom. Positive notes to pass on there to Ailbhe.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I'm Ailbhe McNabola. I'm Deputy Chief Exec at Power to Change. So I just wanted to say a little bit before I kind of get into the exam question around the perspective I'm coming at with looking at this question today. So Power to Change, we're an independent social change organisation. We support communities to establish and run businesses to improve the places where they live. So these are businesses which are accountable to local people. They are across the country, but they are predominantly in the more deprived parts of the country. So about half of community businesses are in the 30% most deprived areas of England. These businesses employ local people. 86% of their staff are local to the business. They're creating opportunity in places where maybe opportunity is thinner on the ground. They are taking on local assets. They are sort of reviving the physical fabric of places and giving that sense of actually tangible improvement that people are looking for. And keeping wealth in the local economy. We know that from the work that we've done, 56p in the pound that these businesses spend stays local compared to about 40p for private businesses. So, I think you'll agree, something good that's happening in a lot of communities around the country. And that's the perspective I'm coming at when we look at this question around levelling up and making an assessment of progress. Obviously, a lot has changed since the levelling up phrase was coined. And heading towards an election, I think people are predominantly probably thinking about things like the NHS and cost of living crisis. But we do know that levelling up definitely still matters, and others on the panel have said that. Some work we've been doing recently with More in Common has been sort of polling on that and asking people, and actually it's coming through still really strongly, and particularly with that loyal national group, almost 60% of those people telling us that levelling up is still a really important agenda. So the big question that we've been asked to look at today is around where good progress has been made and what more could be done to build on that. We did some work on this earlier in the year, and there was 3 particular areas that came through, particularly from that community and community business perspective that mattered. The first has been touched on a number of times by the panel, but funding. So levelling up funding, I'm not the first to say it, and even Secretary of State Michael Gove has admitted it's been too complex. It has been centrally controlled pots. It has not necessarily gotten it to the ground as quickly as it should have done. So we know that we need to do funding differently for communities that need it most to get hold of it. And there have been some welcome developments. The Community Ownership Fund, which we were really pleased to see happen, has also seen some recent changes where it's been making it a bit more accessible to those kinds of communities. But also today's announcements around the towns plan, the idea of local endowments, the idea that communities are in charge of decisions about where that money gets spent, could be really, really exciting. Obviously, we'll have to see how that plays out, but that is, I think, we talked about transformational change that isn't just hanging baskets. That could be really exciting. And if you look ahead to something like the Community Wealth Fund, where dormant assets funding will come on stream and a lot more resources will be available, if we can take those ways of doing things forward, it could be really transformational. 2 other areas that came through in our work as important. Devolution has been touched on. Absolutely, and this is a positive story for Conservatives. This is an area where there has been really good progress. And the thing that we would keep pushing on is, as well as the settlements and the sort of trailblazer deals around the country, it's also always thinking about that neighbourhood level. So how do we continue to push devolution right down to community level? Because people want to be able to impact decisions of, want to be able to make decisions that impact their local area. They want to be able to feel they have that influence. And so we have to think about how we get that from mayors down to local communities. The Levelling Up white paper talked about a review of neighbourhood governance, and that's something I think really still needs to happen. On high streets, there's some good measures happening. High street rental auctions are soon coming in. There's also the high street accelerators coming, which some of you may know about, which again will give communities more control on their high street than they've really had before. These are all good developments, but in our we have a pamphlet left around the room. We talk about community right to buy, really giving communities the power to take on high street properties, and a British High Street buyout fund. So I think there are ways of pushing that further. So just to sum up, quite a few people have talked about empowering communities as being a really important way of delivering this agenda, and it is handily the title of our small report. Community businesses, which I started off talking about, are embedded in their local areas. They're economic actors. They're already in places. They're already delivering, and I think they would be the kinds of partners you want to work with to deliver a reset and levelling up. There's 3 policy change areas where we think would make a difference to really helping deliver on that potential. It's around power, resources, and backing community business. So around power, we would like to see a next government introducing a landmark Community Power Act to give communities the power to control services, places where they live. On resources, I've mentioned it already, but we would like to see the Community Ownership Fund extended and expanded. and also investment in a British high street investment vehicle. So the Community Ownership Fund is, of course, public funding, and it would be really, really important to move on to thinking about how private investment can be brought in to this agenda. And on backing, we think the next government should back enterprise and community businesses in the same way that other businesses are supported. So we've proposed a 75% business rate relief, entirely funded by closing something called the box shifting loophole, which some of you may or may not know about, but if you want to know more, we've talked about it in our paper. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ailbhe, there for putting the case for empowering communities. Without further delay, I'll invite James to comment from an LGA perspective.
Ex-LGA perspective.
Ex-LGA, sorry. Yeah.
Very important. I can be for it. Listen, I agree pretty much with everything everyone else has said. Levelling up really matters. And if you look at it, in the UK it's different to virtually every other country in Europe. Our major cities, with the exception of Bristol, underperform the UK average in terms of GVA, GDP, etc. And the question is why? Cities normally outperform because you have the clustering benefits of a city, and they fail. And we need to ask ourselves why. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is the fact that they're all based on traditional cities, Manchester, Bradford, etc., traditional mill towns, Stoke, a pottery town. That business is no longer there. The world now is essentially about people. It's about skill, it's about knowledge, it's about service, it's about tourism. Yes, industry still exists. So what you need to be is somewhere that is attractive to people, attractive to visit, attractive to live in, attractive to educate your children, to grow up, to live old. That's what we need to be. And the places that are attractive are the places that will be successful. And my question here is, how many people are leaving London to come and live in Manchester? Or is the flow the other way around? I think Bristol is the only major town or city where there is a flow out of London too. Now, how do we do that? And I think that's essentially about genuine devolution. I always give the example of Birmingham at the turn of the 20th century, where the Chamberlains completely transformed Birmingham, putting in public health, good housing, libraries, civic buildings, etc. They absolutely would not be allowed to do it today, because there'd be about 500 Whitehall committees, about 2,000 grants that they'd have to get. They just did it. They were allowed to do it. So how do we create that entrepreneurial spirit where people are allowed to do it? And I accept that there will be failures. But actually there will be many more successes that you can learn from. And I think it is a good point. This is about long term. If you have to bid for government money, it is not about the long term, because you don't know about next year's bid. And I won't say which place it is a town. You know, they bid for 3 grants. They got 2 of the 3, sounds pretty good, except the 3rd grant was the bridge between the other 2. So the other 2 were worthless. You know, if you had some local funding scheme, so I think we need real devolution of funding. We should have either an outcome-based funding from government that is known for the next 20, 30 years, where they don't tell you what projects you're investing in. They don't even assess your projects. They just say, here are the 10 metrics we're judging you on, you know, average income, education, housing, whatever it is. And if you deliver, we'll give you the next one. Even better if they genuinely devolve taxation. Now, you'd have to do a levelling up because, you know, clearly Manchester is not going to get the same business rates as Westminster. Now, we've done that for business rates, so why can't we do it for stamp duty or local income tax or a sales tax? So now all of a sudden, I, as a town or village or city, know what my long-term income is. I know if I invest up front and I build a nice housing estate and I help support the university, that here is the potential income that I can use. It's a long-term strategy. It doesn't depend on who the Chancellor of the Exchequer is or which party is in government. So I think we need to devolve funding. Clustering matters. Government has got a role. You know, funding of universities is not going to be done on a local basis. Whether you agree with HS2 or not, that is a national scheme, as is building a new motorway. But get out of the way and let local government deliver local health, local education, local environment stuff, local planning, and allow different places to do different things. We also need to enable councils to do more. You know, we can't get the assets. If I try and get, and in fact, if I take Central Beds as an example, we have an ex-RAF base. It is surplus to requirements. We had people bidding to put a film studio there, a tech park in there. Could we get the MOD to release the site? No. They wanted to build houses, despite the fact it was in a bomb exclusion zone because there was a missile manufacturing site on the side. Couldn't build any houses. So devolve to local government, allow that, but that also means accountability. And I think one of the big issues that we have is leaders are not accountable because they can blame government. And I know that there are a large number of leaders, all too conveniently, will blame lack of funding, lack of this, lack of the other, and they'll be half right. And we need to remove that half. And I think the key point that you made, the moment a minister, that the Daily Mail, asks a minister, why is there a transport problem in Manchester? And the minister goes, excuse me, and they go, oh, sugar, yes, I should have been asking Andy Burnham. That's when you have real devolution, when the person on the spot is asked the question, not the minister. If you're going to have the minister being asked the question, then they're not going to want to release it. I would also say that Whitehall really doesn't want to release it. I think there's a civil servant issue here with turkeys and Christmas. So I would say that. I've got lots of other comments, but we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, James. Devolution is a recurring theme here, but also the clustering benefits of cities and the need for places to be more attractive to people in the widest sense of the word. Zoe, I'm conscious that you're the last of 7, so feel free to reflect on what you've heard, or indeed if there's anything anything else particularly that you think is key for this discussion.
Thanks very much. I would just say, look, as Ailbhe said earlier, people still want and expect levelling up to happen. It's gone a bit quiet at the national level on levelling up. Those of us who are working on the agenda have noticed. But at the local level and at the regional level, nobody's forgotten about it. So let's not confuse kind of political appetite or media appetite at a national level with what's actually happening in the rest of the country. I live in Liverpool, work in Manchester. People still talk about levelling up or whatever the next phrase is going to be, but nonetheless, it's an idea that still sticks. So let's not forget that. I think what's gone right, devolution, yes, I'd say specifically about the trailblazers to the metro mayoral level. I think the single pot stuff that's coming up this autumn has real potential, basically undoing the silos between all the different funding streams that someone, working in Greater Manchester gets. I think Greater Manchester has about something like 55 different funding streams, and it won't undo all of those silos, but it will put some of that money together and allow actual innovation to happen at the local level. I think bus franchising, right direction. Levelling up funding today, I've got a lot of qualms about it, but at least it's being done on some sort of criteria this time that are transparent and open, and I think that's some sort of progress. I would say, though, that we still need to put big numbers in context. And so when we talk about, 1.1 billion announced just for this panel today, I think, so that we could latch on to that number and all get really excited about it. But let's not forget, our latest research at IPPR North shows that local authorities have sold off £15 billion worth of assets in the last 13 years. Some other analysis shows that local authorities currently have a shortfall of 3.5 billion in cash. So 1.1 in levelling up money, 3.5 shortfall billion in cash. You've got to kind of put this in the context of the actual state of local government. And of course, we had Birmingham in the news 2 weeks ago. We've had many other local authorities, more to come this year. Local government is not in a good state, and the status quo cannot continue. And whilst, additional funding is welcome, that is not going to reverse, undo, patch up the holes that are in the offer of local government. So looking ahead, that would be one of the areas that whoever is the incoming government variant of will have to really tackle head on. This is not an issue now that you can just sort of pretend will go away and hope that they'll take another round of cuts and be quiet about it. That's not going to happen. I think we also have to make sure we're holding kind of devolved power feet to the fire. So we've talked about double devolution. I think that's exactly right. Devolving power to the metro mayor level, totally right. But, we still haven't quite sorted out the dynamic with local authorities, the dynamic then down to communities. So there's still some work to do there, I would say. Another thing which probably won't make me very popular in this room, but wealth is increasingly becoming the regional divide of this country, and intergenerational wealth included in that. So I think there's a massive tension at the moment for the Conservative Party in the discussion over, say, inheritance tax, because actually wealth is becoming the regional divide. Wealth is becoming the the ticket, the golden ticket, if it wasn't already, for your life chances. And I don't think that can be ignored, and I wouldn't want that to go under the table unspoken about, so I am going to raise it here. And then also I would say commit and stick. You know, HS2, if I do one more piece of media on HS2 this month, I think I will go slightly mad. But, you know, transport investment, I thought we had all agreed was the one bit of investment that generates a return that we all find acceptable, and yet now we're even pulling the rug potentially on HS2 between Birmingham and Manchester. So I can only implore the government to stick to its original plan and take it to Manchester, not only for HS2's sake, but also because of the connectivity to Northern Powerhouse Rail that goes from Liverpool to Hull, and without HS2 in the second leg, that will be totally undermined. So commit and stick is my final plea. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much to all our panellists there, and to Zoe there for your reflections on the commit and stick, the need for the single pots, and the state of local government, as well as some themes there. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go straight to the floor. If I could invite people to say who they are and where they're from organisation-wise, and we've got a roving mic, so there's a lady at the front here. Thank you very much.
I'll not stand up. Rachel Anderson from North East Chamber of Commerce, so we're well in the big levelling up areas. Just a question, and I was sort of listening to the panel, and I agree with a lot of what was said by the panel, and I was thinking, nobody's going to say this, and then Zoe touched on it. I didn't hear anything really about capacity building for the people who've actually got to do this. So we know Zoe was talking about local authorities, but we are, because of where they are financially, we are desperately short of really good planners. We're desperately short of people who can do a good compulsory purchase order. We don't have the legal officers. Economic development has slipped. We've got a lot of people retiring who are taking a lot of experience with them, and nobody coming up behind them. So it seems to me that it's almost kind of the silent plank of levelling up, is that actually you do need people on the ground who have to deliver all of this, and it's really hard to do if you don't have experience. So I just wondered what the panel's viewpoint was on how we build that capacity, because it's great having 30 million for buying a load of buildings and cleaning up the town centre, but if you've got nobody who knows how to spend that 30 million, it's very difficult.
Thank you very much. I think there was a gentleman at the back. There we go. Thank you very much.
Hello, Gintas Vilkelis, Localism 2.0. I actually did a thorough study about what are the causes of the regional economic imbalance, and the answer came out that the current fiscal hyper-centralization of this country is the key root cause, which makes it absolutely inevitable to happen. And furthermore, this problem is fundamentally unsolvable for as long as the country remains structured the way it is. And regarding what Councillor Jamieson said, so actually the correct solution is number 2, devolved taxation. Essentially, it's important to make the local authorities run much more like proper business. They're empowered to raise most of their revenue and to decide how to spend it. I mean, the reason why private companies don't just basically send most of their money to the government and then get some of the money back for the running costs, there's a good reason. Otherwise, this country, people would be fleeing to Zimbabwe looking for a better life from this country. Yet currently, the system is badly misdesigned. So, and I'll be happy to send you more information about the details.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to do one more gentleman here at the front.
Yeah, this is addressed probably as much to Councillor Jamieson as anyone. I think the point about sort of grinding devolution and accountability down to a really local level sounds really good. I don't think many of us in this room would disagree with it. But I represent a company called Arcadis. It's a global engineering design and program management company. We work a lot around supporting local authorities and private sector investors deliver a whole range of big stuff. If you have that localized approach, how do you make sure that you have the skills, the capability, and the capacity to compete for foreign direct investment on a global stage, so that you can actually get those projects funded and delivered?
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've got two questions there that cover this sort of capacity issue in different ways, and then sort of comment on the unsolvable issue under the current structure and the need for devolved taxation. Any takers, James?
Yeah.
James, did you want to start with the last one?
Well, I'll start with both of them. The capacity issue is one of the big problems is we've got short-term funding. So you just take somebody on who's half decent, you keep them for 18 months, and then you have to let them go. You know, so one, if you actually had long-term funding and you knew where you were, you could train people up. Mm-hmm. In terms of planners, the planning system in the UK is pants. It doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for business. It doesn't work for house builders. It needs to be streamlined. It needs to be clearer. It needs to be more certain. We need to make more demands of some of the house builders, but we also need to make it easier for them to build, provided they meet what we need. There is also a capacity issue, which I didn't mention in local government, which is social care. We spend all our time and our money worrying and thinking about social care because it's what will break councils. And we don't spend enough time on place shaping. And actually one of the ways we can solve social care is more devolution of things like health and housing, which would help us. So I think that would help. On your point about localised skills and capability, I think there is a role for government, and I think government can do frameworks and provide this is the standard thing. And I'll use the example of battery storage. So we're having lots of battery storage put all over the UK. It is utterly stupid that every council is having to come up with, you know, what is the fire suppressant that you need on battery storage? How far apart do you need every cell? You know, all that sort of thing. No, we need a national planning guidance that says this is what a safe battery storage site looks like. Now, local council decide what screening you want, decide what hours people are allowed to work. That's the local bit. So there is a real role for proper, centralised, I'd call it building regs, and we need that. But then the local bit is about what's our priority? Where would we like our housing built? And in the same way, and I always like Germany, you know, when they pitch for business, they go to all the world fairs, and it's the government who goes there, and then they allow the local areas to have their own little cubicle or whatever. So it is that mix and match, but you devolve, and the central bit does what central should do best. And it's a simple question. Why am I doing this centrally? And if you can answer the question, then do it. We don't all want our own little armies in each council. It's absolutely the right thing to do nationally. But why Whitehall thinks it's best for, you know, determining where houses are and how we should clean streets and, you know, how our schools should operate and all these silly local things. I mean, I always remember Tony Blair saying, you know, every town, every area should have 2 policemen. Well, I quite like the idea, but actually that might not be the right solution locally. Let the locals decide it. Sorry.
Thank you. Did you want to comment?
Well, absolutely, and I'm going to agree with much of what James said. But first, the gentleman at the back, I've read your report. It's excellent. And I'm not just saying that to suck up, I promise. No, I did a really interesting trip as a minister. The only overseas travel I did was to go to Germany, and I was really keen to go to Germany to really see the impact of their post-reunification transformation, because obviously there was clearly an incentive after the war in bringing Germany back together to really do this and do it right on a grand scale. But that level of ambition, really putting their money where their mouth is and decentralising, allowing regional government to really take forth, it has taken a long time to see some of those benefits. But they really are seeing some of those benefits. In Saxony, for example, Saxony is now leading the way in digital. Like, looking back sort of 50, 60 years, you never thought that that would be what was going on in that particular region in Germany. And yet by empowering them, letting them make local decisions, taking tax-raising powers locally, allowing them to really empower themselves and sort of create their own destiny. I want to see much more of that ambition here in the UK, and having worked on the devolution side of things, trying to get other departments in Whitehall to give us just a little bit more. Can we have honestly, at times it felt like Oliver, you know, with Bolsey, please can we have a few more powers, a little bit more funding? It's a tough thing, and I think our country has been so centralised for so long, it's going to be difficult to see that true devolution and let people let go of the reins. But that's why accountability is absolutely key here. If we know that there are proper accountability structures in place locally, then that gives people a bit more comfort in handing over those reins. And that's why part of what we were doing over the past year as well is working on a devolution accountability framework to really kind of look at what those structures should look like. Again, very geeky. A lot of what I did was very geeky, but really, really important nonetheless. And then just on the point about capacity funding, Rachel, completely with you. Obviously, in order to do that right, it does have to be longer term, but we recognised it as a huge challenge, particularly for some of the smaller councils that maybe had a team of 2 or 3 people working in these departments who were expected to draw up bids, put in bids, wait for the feedback, and then work this up into a tangible proposal, get it back to government, and then actually enact it as well. It was completely unfeasible. So as a short-term measure to try and help, we have put in place some short-term funding as well for capacity to buy in training, buy in experts, buy in consultants. It's not the answer, but it's just a way of trying to help in the short term so that, you know, the towns that have got this brilliant funding that really could be transformational can be used to its maximum potential. So we've listened, but certainly that longer term devolution of funding is absolutely the right way to go to make sure local areas have the capacity they need to.
Thank you. Joe,
I just want to very quickly say, you're absolutely right. So I was one of the MPs who secured the capacity funding from Rishi. Stoke-on-Trent had £56 million worth of levelling up bids and absolutely didn't have the capacity to complete the bids on time. The problem is, as you rightly identified, that's a short-term solution because they had to get consultants in. So the ability to do that in the longer term is not embedded in the council, which is key. And to the gentleman at the back, so I'm an absolute champion of community banking and regional banking as a way of empowering regions and communities to look after themselves and boost their own enterprise activity. And I think that you know, Germany's a classic example. I think in the time that Germany has increased its regional banking by about 35%, ours has been reduced by 25%. So, you know, it's something that we absolutely need to tackle.
Thank you. I'm going to go for more questions if there are in the room. There's a gentleman at the front, lady in the middle. And Mike is just on the way.
Thank you. Joe just touched on the issue I wanted to ask about, actually, which is we haven't really talked about financial institutions that much in this discussion. And apart from Ailbhe mentioning the Dormant Assets Act, I run Access, the Foundation for Social Investment, which is a beneficiary of that. And that is a fantastic scheme. But in the scheme of the challenge we're talking about here, it's a drop in the ocean. Is it time to think about a Community Reinvestment Act in the UK like the one that exists in the United States? For those who aren't familiar, it's a very simple piece of legislation that requires banks to disclose how much of their lending they're doing in the communities where they're based and in different communities around the country. So it's very easy to see that capital is flowing into communities that need it the most. It's very simple. It's a piece of transparency rather than compulsion, but it has driven enormous change in the capitalization of community development finance institutions in the US, and I think the role that financial institutions have to play in this is something that we need to talk more about.
Thank you very much. The lady in the middle.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask exactly the same question. So there we go. Short and simple.
Oh, quite literally. Okay. There's another lady on the other side. Thank you very much. Can we ask where you came from, just so the context of the question?
I'm Sam from the Finance Innovation Lab. I'm coordinating Fair Banking Fraud campaign.
Thank you very much.
Hi there, Lainey Mathers. I'm from the University of Nottingham. And I think a couple of panel members touched on it, but the role that universities obviously play in levelling up, being present in lots of those communities and having both an education and skills part to play in the levelling up agenda, but also that research and innovation and clusters and driving infrastructure that brings jobs and skills. But I suppose I'm coming at it from a perspective of universities and education is also a really great global export, but that's one of the things that feels like it's getting more challenging. And certainly when we're thinking about international students and how welcome international students are to come here, we've seen loads of changes over the last couple of years that just make it harder for universities to be attractive to those international student audiences. So I'd be interested in any perspectives about that and about that as an international export and the way that we bring money into those communities through education.
That's great. Do we have one more question, given two with the same? There's a gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Richard Roberts, I'm the leader of Hertfordshire County Council, and we spend about £1 billion worth of taxpayers' money, and most of it raised in Hertfordshire itself. And government trusts us at the moment to run children's services, adult care social services, and a fire service, and fix the roads and do a whole bunch of stuff. But if we should dare to want to run higher further education or perhaps even franchise buses, we have got to have another layer of bureaucracy. And I think it's worth reflecting on added bureaucracy. We've touched on a bit already about delayering some of the governance, minimising short-termism, and I think getting that right is probably the trick to really getting places to motor that are struggling to motor at the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got a comment there about the sort of the bureaucracy issue. This Community Reinvestment Act and the social investment side of things, and then an education question as well. Anyone like to start?
I can start on, but on universities and the bureaucracy point, where
Yes,
I agree that universities are an important global export. They're a real success of the UK, and actually I think they can play a really important role in levelling up. But I think that they can't do that on their own. And I think one thing that's really important is that we have good local economic strategies that properly integrate both sort of the business side and the university side. And that, going back to the previous question about foreign direct investment as well, that allows us to make then a much more compelling case for an area or a region. And I think that, linked to the gentleman's previous question, that's much easier to do at a slightly larger scale. The UK has stood out for a long time internationally and having that sort of missing middle tier of government. So I would challenge the claim that it's just an extra layer of bureaucracy. There are certain powers and certain policies that really do need to sit at that slightly higher level, take a bit more of a strategic economic view across a whole labour market. Now, what that doesn't mean is that every policy that we devolve and as we devolve belongs at the combined authority level. There should be a question each time about what is the appropriate layer for these policies to sit at. There should also be the question that Zoe touched on before about how are communities and local authorities feeding into what combined authorities are saying. But I actually think it's not just another layer of bureaucracy, at least in the places that have it so far, and it's actually been an important innovation.
Thank you, Ed. Any other takers for those questions?
I'm more in the Richard Roberts camp on this one. I think we have a two-tier system with counties and districts, and to have a three-tier, or as in the case of Cambridgeshire, about a six-tier system, doesn't work. Now, it would be a different question. If you go to Manchester, you have a mayor and, is it 9 unitary councils? To go to Hertfordshire and say you're going to have a mayor and a county and districts is too much. So it would be different if there were unitary councils underneath it. I think even Richard would agree with me on that.
Not if there's 10 districts in the room.
The one thing I would say is, in terms of which powers are devolved locally and which ones are not, seems entirely at random in this country and arguably completely the wrong way round. I mean, if you look at social care, arguably that should be much more national eligibility requirements, much more closely aligned with the NHS. Schools as well, there is a national curriculum, and yet these are devolved, whereas buses and skills, which clearly should be locally run, are not, and there doesn't seem to be any rationale has ever been set out for what is devolved, locally run and what is.
I would though say on social care, even though it's killing councils, the thought of social care going to the NHS would be a complete and utter disaster, because it is about local delivery of care to a person. It isn't something that you can set up a huge national stream. And if social care was as run as well as the NHS, we would be in deep doo-doo.
Did you want to come on?
Yeah, and come up on a few points there. I think the tension the lady raised about kind of immigration policy basically and universities and regional inequality or levelling up is a really interesting one, and I think that speaks to the point actually you were making earlier, Tom, about kind of regional inequality, levelling up, regional rebalancing, whatever you want to call it, but cutting through all of government policy and being a lens through which we see everything, because then you air those tensions like the wealth regional inequality tension that I alluded to earlier. That's a clear tension. You might want to make a political call on it either way, but it is a tension that comes up if you look through the lens of regional inequality, as is your point on basically immigration policy. If you looked at it through a lens of regional inequality, you might come up with a different solution. Just on linking the points on Devo and foreign direct investment, I think, and capacity building actually, because I thought that was a really interesting point. I think there is something about like pride in public service and the way that local authorities have been eroded over the last sort of 13 years or so, has been very much on the resource front, and the money that's been given back to them is on capital. And now I think we're seeing that kind of reach its limit in terms of, you can't take any more capital on if you haven't got the resource to deal with it, which is exactly, I think, the points that people were making here in the room. So that's good in a sense that maybe, you know, it's not nice that we've had to reach that critical stage, but at least like there seems to be a now common recognition that that's where we're at in terms of the balance of local authority funding. And just on FDI and the kind of which level, to your point, kind of which level is best, I think that was quite interesting, because increasingly as well we're seeing the mayors kind of clustered together and kind of go internationally as a group of mayors. And I think that just shows like the tension you're raising, that like it, you know, it can get a bit messy and complicated if we forever go down and down in terms of like international trade policy or whatever, but there can be new forums and new alliances formed that I think is really interesting. And then just finally on the finance point, because I don't think any of us have spoken to it yet, I would be really interested to speak to you about this, because sometimes when I'm thinking about financing by banks in different places across the country, I'm very willing to be challenged on this, but this is why I like to speak to you about it. I'm sometimes like, is that really the issue? And I'm all for more transparency of like banks saying where they're lending to and who they're lending to. I think that can only be a good thing. I just wonder if there's just so much stuff around it that would actually make the step change for which places are being invested in across the country. And that's maybe another tension to discuss, but I'd really like to pick that up.
Lovely. Joe, can I give you... I think you wanted to come in on
just
education, but also can I give you the final word, because we're actually out of time.
So
no pressure, we've got a few minutes.
Yes, and I just wanted to come in on education. So I was on a panel with Staffordshire University who've done a student needs survey, and the role of universities in left behind areas is absolutely vital. But the challenges for those universities to get students from the severely disadvantaged backgrounds to stay on their courses, to not suffer the mental health challenges, the food challenges. So Staffordshire University provides a food bank for students, and there's all sorts of extra challenges. And I think that when we want to make sure that we're levelling up, we need to look at supporting students as well.
Marvellous. Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to the end of the Levelling Up debate. Very engaging and wide-ranging discussion, so thanks very much. Well, yeah, not the end of this one. We do have 15 minutes or so left for mingling and having something to eat at the back, so please do stay if you have the time. I've got a few things that I'm asked to mention, which is if you'd like to sign up to Bright Blue, speak with the team at the back or online, and it's £20 for membership and £10 for students. We're running 18 events, so please check the flyers on your chairs for more information. And our next event is in this room at 7 p.m. on social cohesion. We also have Andy Street speaking, obviously the Mayor of West Midlands, this evening at 8:30 for our drink tank. But before that, can I give a final thank you to our panel and to our guests for your questions as well.